everybody. So here we are, Michelangelo's David. First of all, just a couple of things. I will be using a pointing device, so look out for the red dot. We'll be zooming on some images. So let's make a start, everybody. We're looking here at the most famous statue in the world, probably Michelangelo's David. It's very difficult to get a scale of this massive statue. It's just over 17 feet tall, so it's absolutely vast. And he carved it as a very, very young man, as we're about to see. So what we're going to do, it's going to be a little similar to the way that the previous talk was done, in that we'll look a little bit at Michelangelo's early life before we get to the David. But he does carve David from a very young age, from like 24, 25 years old. So let's take a look. Okay, now this is a very famous painting by one of his contemporaries, Raphael, and this is in Rome. And the reason for showing you this, and this painting may well be the subject of a future talk, Raphael used many of his contemporaries actually in this painting. This is the School of Athens showing various different intellectuals and philosophers. But down here, this is Michelangelo. So this is an actual image of him. This is Leonardo da Vinci here. And Raphael's done a self-portrait of himself over here. Let's zoom in a little bit. So this is Michelangelo. He wasn't very happy in other people's company. He much preferred being by himself. And this painting actually was painted whilst Michelangelo himself was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And for many of us, that's the reason why we know him best, because when we go to Rome, many of us will have a guided tour that will take us into the Vatican, and you'll see the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But he was trained as a sculptor from a young boy. He didn't particularly want to do any painting, but when you're a young art student, you're obliged to. So he was a brilliant draftsman. He was great at drawing, and he learnt to paint, as we'll see any second now. So this is a portrait of him done by one of his assistants, obviously when he was quite a lot older, so he's about 60 here, I think. And the assistant is called Daniele de Volterra, who has drawn a pretty good image of Michelangelo here, except that he's been quite kind to him, because Michelangelo had a badly broken nose, and that's not really clear from this painting. A rival, when he was a young man in Florence, completely smashed his nose in, so he looked a bit like a rugby player, I suppose. This painter became quite famous, actually, after Michelangelo died, because after Michelangelo died, there was a law that was passed by a Vatican council that it was illegal to have naked figures in church paintings. And so this is the Last Judgment painted by Michelangelo. This is in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And a lot of these loincloths that you can see were painted on by Daniele de Volterra after Michelangelo had died. And when this was cleaned, many of the loincloths were removed, such as here. But many of them did stay. And so this is, he had a huge job to fill in what Michelangelo had left all the figures naked. Now, Michelangelo is a young art student. He's 13 years old when he gets assigned to a brilliant painter called Domenico Ghirlandaio. So if any of you have been on tour with me in Florence, I would have taken you into this church. And this is the Church of Santa Maria Novella. And as a young art student, aged 13, 14, Michelangelo worked on assisting Ghirlandaio with these beautiful frescoes that still retain their wonderful color. And they are, of course, 500 years old now. Now, Michelangelo was a sculpture student, though, because in 1490, so 2 years after he started working in that church doing the drawings, he was asked to go and work directly for the ruler of Florence, a man called Lorenzo de' Medici. And aged 15 years old, he does this. So this is a block of Carrara marble And this is beautiful, what's called bas relief carving. So it's quite a kind of shallow depth into the stone that he's carved here. But can you imagine a 15-year-old being able to do this? Now, it's quite a small panel, actually. It's if any of you go to Florence, it's in a building called the Casa Buonarroti. Buonarroti is the surname of Michelangelo. For American viewers, that means last name. And that building today in Florence is the building that Michelangelo bought as a present for his father. So he bought his father a house. And it's now been turned into a museum, so you can go and see this. I mean, that is an incredible achievement for a 15-year-old. The other thing to say is that no one was carving into marble at this point. Sculptors had made bronze, they made clay, but no one was doing as the ancient sculptors had done. Only this young boy. So it was something very, very different. This, he did the Battle of the Centaurs. He did this at 17 years old. And this is also, it's opposite. It's in the same museum. And it is fabulous. He kept this with him all his life as a reminder of his original ambition to be a sculptor and a sculptor only. So many of his sculptural projects ended up getting, they were left unfinished, or they were stopped. There were revolutions, insurrections, or lack of funds, or but he always held on to this piece as a kind of personal reminder. Everybody moving on a couple of years, he ends up, he goes to Rome. He basically copies a piece of ancient carving so brilliantly, and it gets sold on the art market in Rome. And quite a wealthy cardinal summons this great sculptor. Rather than being annoyed by it, they actually want to meet him. And so Michelangelo goes there, and this is not an image of Rome, by the way. What I'm showing you here, those of you who know Italy, this here is a map of Tuscany. And the reason for showing you this is right here, the very northern part of Tuscany. This is Carrara, where the great marble mines are. The best quality marble in the world comes from Carrara. And in particular, a particular valley that we'll take a look at now. Let's just zoom in. Everyone, this is the town of Carrara here. This is the port down here, obviously. And then it's up here. So the statue of David, everybody, is carved in a valley called the Fantascritti Valley right here, if you can see that. And the beautiful Pieta, that's dead Jesus in Mary's arms, that is from Polvacchio, which is right here. And Polvacchio is very important because it's where, in ancient times, in ancient Rome, Trajan's column is made of Polvacchio marble. The Arch of Titus in the Forum is made of Polvacchio marble. And also the Arch of Septimius Severus, the emperor, that's at the other end of the Forum. They're all made of that same quality. But the marble mine had been abandoned since ancient times. And it was only Michelangelo was the first one to go there in hundreds of years. And you can see how treacherous it would have been to have carved a block out of here and to dragged it down the hill. In those days, of course, there were none of these roads. It would have been a hugely difficult task. But seriously, how do you take a block of stone like that, because that's what it would have looked like, a hammer and chisel, and that's all you've got, and you turn it into this? And he did it in a year and a half, age 22. So this is obviously Dead Jesus in Mary's Arms. This is in St. Peter's Basilica. Many of you have seen it, no doubt. An extraordinary achievement. Just the block of stone alone attracted a huge amount of interest in Rome when it arrived in the docks. Nobody had seen anything like this in Rome since ancient times. And they were even more amazed when they saw the finished product in St. Peter's Church, St. Peter's Basilica, a year and a half later. So he becomes very famous because of this overnight. And then the date for the finish of this is about 1499. He makes his way back to Florence because his friends tell him there's a massive block of stone that needs his attention in Florence. And it's for David. So this is the first drawing for David. We can see it looks nothing like what David will end up looking like. You can see the head of Goliath down there. It's just a sketch, really. There's an arm there, up there. Nothing comes of that until He gets the inspiration, though, perhaps from Rome. So this is an image from one of the museums in Rome. And this giant head here is the head of the Emperor Constantine. And we can see his foot over here. And if you're interested, this is a wonderful museum to go to. It's called the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And it's probable that Michelangelo got his idea for the giant sculpture of David from looking at this image of Constantine. So here is David. Of course, he doesn't look as huge as he is. He's 17 feet tall. The block of stone was 18 feet. It was very complicated to carve David because a sculptor had already blocked out the statue originally 25 years before. The idea was he was going to stand on top of the cathedral in Florence. But given his immense weight, he's 6 tons. And so that was never going to be possible to do that. The block of stone is actually very narrow as well. So it's very tall, but very narrow. So Michelangelo was very limited in how he could carve the statue. Here we see David being cleaned. It was in 2004, in fact, when they decided to clean him again. He was quite dirty from having had 500 years outside. Michelangelo carved this. He set up a workshop on the side of the cathedral in Florence. And that cathedral, the workshop was made of wood. It did have a roof on as well when it got quite cold in the winter of 1501. And he carved it in about 18 months and then took several months to polish it. So it was ready by the summer of 1503, but not revealed to the public until 1504. So it was basically a 3-year project. Everybody, the marble itself, though, is quite fragile. The Fantascritti stone is spongier than the Polvacchio stone. It's not as good quality. And so this part down here, there's a lot of weight on this right ankle. And the concern is that they've actually shut down the traffic in Via Ricasoli, which is the street outside the Accademia in Florence today, because David was moved inside in the 19th century to avoid being either attacked, and they were concerned about his preservation too. We see some details, everybody. Let's look close up here. We can see some damage on David's left forearm. You can see that. In 1527, so he'd been standing there for a good number of years. There was an insurrection in Florence, so many revolutions and rebellions, and a flying piece of furniture from the Palazzo Vecchio, which is where the counts of Florence operate from, landed on David's arm, and it took 16 years for this repair to be done. It wasn't finished until 1543. So David's holding there the sling, because of course he's meeting Goliath. And art historians differ in their view. Is this before meeting Goliath, or is it after he's floored him? Art historians don't seem to agree on this. One thing that people often point out is the massive size of the head of David. It seems out of proportion to the rest of the body, and also his right hand seems to be far too big. Everybody, the original commission for David was that he was supposed to be on top of the cathedral, so that's 100 feet in the air. So this is not the sculptor getting confused about anatomy. It's taking into account what David would have looked like from the ground, looking up 100 feet in the air. When he was finally finished, they put him on rollers, and it took 4 days to roll him from the Duomo, the Cathedral of Florence, over to the Piazza Signoria, which is the square in Florence where he was put outside the palace. And on the way, he had stones thrown at him. And when he was uncovered, actually, they covered up his midriff with a kind of almost like a kind of skirt made of kind of like golden, well, like looking like garments. I suppose it was made of leather. And then the tree stump was gilded too, and also the sling was gilded when he stood there in Florence. So he was covered up immediately, in fact. So this is a close-up of David getting his, he gets a vacuum clean every couple of weeks. So this is not the restoration, that's different to the image that you've just seen before. This is him getting his fortnightly vacuum clean. And of course, that's a close-up of the damage that was done to the forearm too. Everybody, David has got a squint. The eyes are not completely aligned. And again, that's the deliberate visual trick. Where he's standing today in Florence, he's looking towards Rome as a kind of, it's a threat. Because Italy was very different to our countries. They were individual city-states. They didn't have the unity that the United States or the United Kingdom has. So Florence was Florence and Rome was Rome. They were not united as a country. The position of David was always a bit contentious because originally he was put over on the left. He's a bit out of view, but the sculptor Michelangelo wanted him right here. This is the Loggia de' Lanzi, which is in the middle of the Piazza Signoria in Florence. And Michelangelo thought that was a good place for him because not least he'd be slightly protected from the weather. But that did not happen. He went directly outside the palace building. And it ended up with David absolutely covered in all sorts of, basically bird poop. He had algae all over him, just dirt. He's been cleaned several times. The cleaning everybody in 1843 was a disaster because they basically bleached him with hydrochloric acid, which definitely made him very white again. But what it did was it poured into the stone, which already had certain structural problems, as I've already said. The Fantascritti stone is quite porous. It's got tiny air bubbles in it. So David is suffering from this point of view. There certainly are cracks in his right ankle. And at the moment, the museum is experimenting with earthquake-proofing base for him, similar to what's used in places like Tokyo Airport. And so we will see what happens in the future. David was attacked in 1991 by a guy with a claw hammer, and the second toe of his left foot was hacked off, or half of it was hacked off. And analysis of that was taken and to identify the actual quarry, definitely where the stone comes from. But look at the incredible anatomical detail here. Look at the way, for example, the veins are carved in the hands. The veins are everywhere. This is not the best quality image ever, but up close, he's a very intimidating sight indeed. And you can see, you can get the sense of how enormous this statue is. It's this toe here, that's the one that got hacked off. And unfortunately, the person who did that has done it to other works of art too in Italy, so I'm not quite sure why people keep on doing this. Today, everyone, if you go into the Academy where David is, there's a perspex screen around him, so you can't get up to, you can't get close anymore. In 2010, a copy of David was put on top of the Duomo, and you can see this is the original contract. David was supposed to be seen from this height, and he was put up there for one day in November 2010. And there's another image too of this, so that's a great view of what he would have looked like. And then other statues were meant to be here, and so on, like round the edge of the dome is what you're looking at there. Everybody, Michelangelo is known as a sculptor and he's known as a painter, but look at this for a drawing. He did this drawing just before he left Florence for the final time. It dates from the 1530s, and we're lucky enough that it's in the British Museum. In fact, his family sold off many of the drawings to the British Museum in the 19th century. And this drawing is quite large, actually. It's 2/3 life size, and it's of a young banker's son. But look at that. It is phenomenal. So this is a side of his work we don't often see. A magnificent draftsman as well, sculptor and architect. He was, of course, also the designer of the Dome of St. Peter's Basilica. And that, along with the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Pieta Dead Jesus in Mary's Arms, and of course David, is what he's most famous for. So that, everybody, is the end of my talk on David. I hope you enjoyed it. Microphone's on.
Thanks, Simon. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well done, Simon. That was
You are-
lovely.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Simon.
Any
Cheers.
questions? Any
Thank
questions
you.
before I switch it around?
Oh,
Yeah,
hello,
Simon.
Auntie Jane.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Auntie Jane. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And you?
Good, thank you. Yes, we're all absolutely fine. Hello from Oregon. And lots of love.
Hi, Sue.
Hi, Simon. Thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful. It's really good of you to do this.
You're
Yeah,
most welcome.
lovely.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. Next week, we're moving countries. We're going to go to Spain, to Madrid, actually, and we're going to look at a very famous painting in the Prado Museum. It's called Las Meninas by Velasquez.
Las meninas, love meninas.
Yeah. So,
Painting
yeah,
in
this
the
will be the
Grove
subject.
Rock.
Yeah, that's the subject of next week's talk. I always get a preparation because I do this talk for my colleagues one day before I do it for all of you. And it's pretty scary speaking to my colleagues because, of course, they're highly accomplished public speakers in their own right.
Oh, you're doing a great job.
Yeah, Simon, you were doing fine.
I'm a
Great,
colleague
thank you.
and I couldn't have done it better.
Wait,
Way
I'm just going to
worse.
switch this off now so I can see you all. Hold on, wait. Just let me change this. Hold on.
No, I don't.
Yes, James, it was excellent.
Simon, while you're doing that, you mentioned
Yeah.
that art historians are disagreeing whether he did that before Goliath or after. What's your opinion on that?
I think it's very hard to know. There's quite a bulging vein in his neck, and an American doctor has recently come up with an article that suggests that if you had that permanently, you'd have a big medical problem. But when you see like a singer like belting it out or something, you'll see that vein throbbing, and so it's possible that he's just finished that action.
Okay. I like it.
Unfortunately, Michelangelo, he destroyed many of his drawings, and if he did do models of these sculptures, he destroyed them too. So there's very little left for us to look at, and that will be a problem next week too with Velasquez, because there's not much written about him. He's quite a hard guy. Basically, you're looking at him from his pictures only. There aren't really biographies of him that. I mean, Michelangelo was extremely famous during his lifetime, and there were 2 books written about him before he died. And he was also very, very wealthy during his life as well. So he is a very different person to many of the other artists that struggled through their lives.